I had an email from a viewer named Martin asking if I can show him how to add detail to models using bump maps. So today I thought I'd create a little video showing you how to do just that, as well as a few other little tips and tricks for adding detail to geometry. But are bump maps the best way to add detail to geometry, especially for 3D printing? Let's find out. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you how to get a terrain depth map from anywhere in the world and turn that into 3D printable geometry. We'll then take a table that Martin has supplied, which is low res from Thingiverse, and add detail using a bump map. And then we'll compare that to adding detail using geometry, just modeling in geometry, and see what the difference is. And finally, we'll take a low res character from Thingiverse and add detail to that character. The first thing we're going to do is to head to a website called terrain.party. Terrain.party allows you to download depth maps from anywhere in the world. I'm just going to make my way over to New Zealand. We recently went for a holiday there and I'm looking for an area called Mount Cook. Once you've found your desired location, make sure it's centered in the middle of the screen, and then it's just a matter of clicking the download icon at the top right of screen, and you'll be prompted to enter in a name for this location. This is primarily just as a naming convention for the files that are going to be downloaded. Once the files are downloaded, you'll be presented with 4 different options. And basically, these are just 4 different data sources. The first is ASTA, which is the most recent public survey of elevation on Earth. It has a 30-metre resolution, but the instrument can get confused by high concentrations of clouds and mountains, creating gaps in the data that need to be repaired by hand, hence the sourcing of the 3 different options. The next map is a merged map, so this is a mix of ASTA, USGS NED data and SRTM30 plus data. The third option is SRTM data, which was originally provided by the Shuttle Radar Topography mission, and it has a resolution of 30 metres in the US, but in other parts of the world it's a 90-metre resolution. And the fourth option is SRTM30 plus data, which is very, very coarse data, which 900 metres in resolution. This might be useful if you'd like to follow the general contours of the land and seafloor without having every single contour shown. Probably the ideal map is the merged one, where you're going to get the most accurate data. But if you're just going for pure detail and you don't mind if there's a cloud that could be mixing up a bit of data, then you'd go for the ASTA. Now it's time to head over to Blender. And the first thing I'm going to do is to create a plane and switch to edit mode. I'm going to go to my top view and I'm going to press U to unwrap and project view from bounds. This will create a UV map for my plane from the top view. I'm now going to my modifiers tab and adding a subdivision surface. I'll bump it up to 2 for now, and I'm also going to add a displacement modifier. I'm going to click the new button to add a new texture and go to my texture slots. I'm going to search for my displace texture, and I'm going to load the image I downloaded from terrain.party. Open the image and you'll see that my object has been displaced, but it's just displacing it on a very low resolution, if you like, and that's because my UV map is not properly lined up at this point. So I'm going to add some subdivision to the material, to the geometry. As you can see, I still have an issue that the map is not matching up to my geometry. So I'm just going to switch to my UV editor window, just drag another window across and check to make sure that my image is lined up with my geometry, which it appears to be fine there. But there is one thing I need to do to make sure it's properly set up, and that is to go to the texture coordinate and switch it to UV in my displacement modifier. And now you can see it's displacing correctly. I just got to drop the strength down a little bit to get it to where I want it to be. And you can see here it's low res. I need to add more geometry or more subdivisions to my my mesh. There's two ways of doing that. I can just up the subdivision modifier, or I can physically subdivide the mesh by breaking it up into smaller pieces, which is W subdivide, W subdivide. I like to do a mix where I'll subdivide to a certain level physically, and then do the rest via a subdivision modifier. As long as the subdivision modifier is ahead of the displacement modifier, the displacement modifier will displace the output of the subdivision surface modifier, which is on top of my physical geometry. So I just want to add a little bit more detail here. So W subdivide, and it's getting to a point where I'm getting pretty happy with what I'm seeing there. So it's a nice resolution, but keep in mind though that the more subdivisions your mesh has, the slower your computer is going to run. So I'm just going to duplicate that so that I don't destroy my original and move it to layer 2. And now I'm going to apply my modifiers to this mesh to then do the finish up and prepare it for export to Cura so I can slice it for my 3D printer. So once everything's applied, I'm going to switch to edit mode, and I've cut out a lot of the slow parts here. I had to wait a little bit between each click to let the computer catch up, so just be patient. And I'm going to select the outer edge, zoom in and just alt click to select that row of vertices. I'll pull back and I'll select the next edge and the next edge until all 4 edges are selected. So it's just Shift Alt right click to select those loops. I'll go around the whole mesh selecting them all, and then once they're all selected, I'm just going to scale them on the Z-axis and zero out the Z-axis. So I'll just right alt click the last, Shift alt click the last edge, hit S, Z and 0, which zeroes out the Z-axis, and then I can move those vertices down on the Z-axis to a depth of where I'd like to see the base of this model, if you like. So once again, I'm cutting out a lot of the time that's being chewed up, waiting for the move to happen. So just be patient. Once I've got that, I can have a look at my mesh. I'm very happy with that. It looks pretty good. The other thing I'll need to do is to put a base on it. It has no base. So if I switch back to edit mode, all my edge vertices are still selected, and all I need to do is just press F on the keyboard to fill those vertices. And that'll just fill it with a plane and finish off my geometry. So now I have a nice piece of detailed geometry which I can now export to my slicer. In this case it's going to be Cura. So just make sure your settings are as they are here, with a scale of 1000, and when we pop into Cura we can see now it's ready to slice and ready to go. We'll start by importing the STL file that Martin sent to me, and as you can see here the scale is set to about 560 meters, so we'll need to divide the unit by 1000 just to bring it down to a more usable scale, and I'll apply the scale so that the scale is now set to 1 before I start working. I'm looking at the table. I can see that the legs aren't lined up properly, so I'm going to need to do a little bit of work to fix that before I start, and I'm going to need to clean up these triangles as well. So we'll go into a little quick time lapse while I get this sorted out. Okay, now that we have our table all nice and clean and quads, I'm just going to make a duplicate of the table and move it to another layer, so I've got a backup of the clean mesh. And we'll switch to edit mode, and I'm going to select all the top faces of the table first using my circle select brush tool. Once all my top faces are selected, I'm just going to drag a UV editor window across, pressing T and N to remove the tool and numeric panels to give me a bit more room. I'm going to assign a shader just so that I can see the texture in my view, so that I can see where the texture is being placed on my model. Just importing the image as an image texture, and I'm going to switch to UV image editor and select my grayscale image, which is the wood texture that I've just imported. So now I need to create some UV information for my table. So if I just press U and project from view bounds, and then rotate the UVs 90 degrees in the UV image editor window, we can see that the texture is being placed onto my table. Now this is not the displacement part, this is just so I can visually see where my texture is lining up. So now I need to just move across my vertices to line up my planks with the texture. Although this is not affecting the displacement yet directly, it will allow me to place the image map so that the displacement will match exactly my UV placement for the image texture. And I can see quite clearly where the mesh is going to be displaced. Okay, now that's done. It's looking pretty good, I think. That's going to work quite nicely. Now I'm just going to do the sides of the table. Same thing again, U, project from view bounds, and I will also need to rotate this 90 degrees in the UV image editor window, and then rescale my UVs so that the UVs line up exactly on one plank. It doesn't matter which plank, I'm just going to pick a random plank and line the UVs up to that plank. Once that's done, you can see that we've done both sides at once. Just going to tweak this a little bit to hide that plank join on the bottom there. And now I'm going to do the ends of the table. U, project from view bounds, and you can see here that the ends of the table are stretched, so I'll need to scale that down to roughly the same proportions as the ends of the table. And once it's scaled down, I can then start lining up those notches on the top of the table with the planks. Now, as you can see here, we do have a bit of an issue, a bit of a tearing happening there, and that's because I don't have geometry coming down from those top notches down to the base of the polygon or to the edge. So I'm going to need to build in some geometry there to fix that. So I'm just going to switch to edge mode and just add some vertices into that edge by pressing W subdivide, which will give me edges that I can, or vertices I can then join together to form polygons on that face. Just subdividing it a few times to give me plenty of vertices to work with. And switching back to face selection mode, I really want to just hide all the other geometry so that I can just focus on this one face. So Control I to invert the selection and H to hide. So all I have left is just this one face I can work on cleanly. I'm going to line these vertices up with the vertices above them, just using the snap tool. So in this case it's pressing G, Y, and mousing over the vertices I want to line up with, and Control X to dissolve any vertices that are left over. And just dissolve these extra vertices. Now that I have those vertices there, I can just select each of them and press J to join, which will create edges through the geometry. And now that that's done, let's have a look how it looks in the UV image editor. I'll press Alt H to unhide the rest of the geometry in edit mode. And selecting all the faces I want, I can reopen my UV image editor window. And load my grayscale image. And we can see here how the UVs are marked up. And we can now fix that in the UV image editor window by just dragging the vertices over and lining them up correctly, which will fix our tearing in our mesh, or in our image texture. Okay, once we have all those corrected, we can now look at sorting out our displacement map. But first I just need to duplicate that end and stitch it back into the other side. Again, I'm going to use snapping to snap the new face in. First I'll delete the old face. I'll press L to select that mesh, which will select link, and snap it to the end. Now that that's lining up, the quickest way to do this is just to press W and select remove doubles to remove any doubled vertices, which will ensure that those vertices are welded back together. And you can see that 20 vertices were removed, and now it's one piece. Although I may have an issue at the bottom here where I need to join this back up. And you can see that J is not working because that piece of geometry there didn't have the vertices on that bottom edge that I had created on the other side. When you have an edge and you press W and subdivide, it creates vertices for both for that edge in both directions, basically. So I'll go through and just add this geometry into the base to correct this issue, and we'll come back shortly. Okay, now that that has been done, I'm just going to duplicate it once again and move it to a new layer, and it's time to start adding our displacement modifier. So the first thing I'm going to do is to add a subdivision surface modifier to give us the geometry we're going to need to displace, because a displacement modifier works by displacing vertices. And as you can see in the middle of our mesh here, there are no vertices. It's just long pieces of clean geometry. So the subdivision surface modifier will go through and fill that mesh with subdivided polygons for then the displacement to then work on. So I'm just creasing the edges of my mesh to give them a nice hard edge corner. And once that's done, then we can look at adding the displacement modifier. Okay, now that we have our UVs done, our mesh in good shape, and our subdivision surface modifier sorted, let's look at adding the displacement modifier. We'll go to the modifier tab, add the displace modifier, select our texture, and set our texture coordinates to UV, and just drop the scale down, otherwise it'll be looking a bit crazy. Now you can see here we're starting to see the effect of the displacement modifier, and if we bump it up a little, can see it's not having a big effect until we increase our subdivisions. And then we can really see the effect that the displacement modifier is having and our texture is having on the surface of the model. You'll also notice that the subdivision sections are rectangular and not square along the side of the model. And that's because our geometry is just long rectangles. This can be rectified by adding loop cuts into the geometry along the long edges and trying to get them back to squarer shapes. But as you'll see, it's not going to have a big impact once we see our final mesh exported as an STL file. I'm just fine-tuning the settings here before we export. I think that's looking pretty good. Let's have a look at how it looks in our slicer. So we'll get a file, export, STL, ensure your settings are as they are shown here, selection only ticked, scale 1000, scene unit ticked, and apply modifiers. That's the big one, make sure that one's ticked. And that modifier will be applied on export. And here it is, our finished model in Cura, ready to slice. As you can see, the detail is holding up quite nicely. The rectangular subdivision sections aren't an issue at all, but they certainly can be refined by adding more loop cuts into the geometry. So that's how you create a displacement map for this particular item, in this case a table, and export it to Cura, ready for slicing. Now let's have a look at adding detail by modelling in some geometry. As you can see here, I've already done a little bit on the side of this table, but basically all it is just using the knife tool to add some cuts into the face of the polygon. And to access the knife tool, it's just a case of pressing the K key, and you then get access to the knife tool. So for this section, we'll just add more geometry, and we'll go into a little time lapse so you can see what I'm doing here, and I shall be back shortly. Once we have our some geometry in there, we can actually start picking up a few vertices here and there to give us the look and feel of timber and timber grain. The purpose of modelling in this way, instead of doing a displacement map, may be that you are looking to try and get a more toony style of wood grain into your model rather than a realistic displacement map look. And this is just a good way to add some geometry into models quickly In this case, it's going to take a little bit of time, but say imagine you had a tree trunk or something like that. You just wanted to roughen a little bit of geometry. This is a nice way of doing it. And you have a lot of control as to the look and final feel of the actual detail in the geometry. Now there is a nice little shortcut to quickly adding random geometry to a model if you've got a lot of detail in the mesh, and that's the proportional editing tool. And if we use that proportional editing tool and set the fall off to random, we only need to select a few vertices and it'll randomize the texture, if you like, of the actual model or the displacement. And you can see here I've just pulled it out a little bit. I just used my scroll wheel on the mouse to make the selection area smaller on the proportional editing tool. But you can see you get quite a nice effect just by doing that as a random effect. So that's another option that you can have for creating and adding detail to geometry. Now let's look at adding detail to a character. The first thing I did was to go into Thingiverse and find this Goblin Monk model by Valander. And the first thing I need to do is to reset the scale. So I set it to 0.01, thinking that probably 25 centimeters is the actual scale. But then I thought, no, it's a Dungeons and Dragons character. It's probably 25 millimeters high. So I ended up with a scale of 0.001. I applied the scale and went to sculpt mode. From here you'll need to tweak the settings to work at the resolution you want to work at. The default was set to 12 pixels. I wanted to go a little bit finer than that, so I tried 6 pixels for my dino topology. Dino topology is just dynamic topology, so it's going to add more detail as you brush on rather than just shape the existing vertices. And I eventually settled on 5. I turned on smooth shading just to see how it's looking, and I was quite happy with that. So with my base setting set, I set to sculpting in some geometry, in this case a collar for a shirt. And as I'm sculpting, I'm noticing that it's affecting the mesh on the other side of the body. So I just undid that, and I'm having a look as to what is causing that. And the cause of that is symmetry. It's symmetrizing across the x-axis. So I just need to turn off the symmetry, and then I can just brush away, and it'll only affect the area that I'm working on. But before we do that, let's switch our model back to edit mode, and I'm just going to convert those triangles to quads. It's always best if we can work with quads wherever possible. Once we're all configured and set up properly, it's just a case of brushing in the detail where you want detail. Most of the time I use the Sculpt Draw brush to lay out geometry. I'll also use clay strips, flatten and smooth. They're probably my 4 go-to brushes. Sculpt Draw lays the material down. Then I use the flatten brush just to flatten it out and give a bit of smoothing and flatness to it. And then I'll use the smooth brush to smooth out areas, and I'll also use crease to get into edges and things, just to define those creases more as well. And you can see here I'm just using the smooth brush to smooth out this area here. And it really comes down to how much time you want to put into it. The more time you put in, the better it's going to look. In the case of the head here, I selected one polygon and just expanded my selection, which is Control+ on the numpad, and then Control I to invert the selection and hide the geometry. It doesn't delete it, just hides the geometry in edit mode. I can then go back to sculpt mode and just work on the head without being having the rest of the mesh making things confusing. So for the eyebrows there, it's just a sculpt draw, but here's where I would use the clay strips, and it's really good for doing muscles or any area that's got a muscularity to it. It has a fibrous look to the brush, and then you can always smooth it out later once you've brushed in your muscle tone and things and to pull it back. And I think that's about it. That's a pretty good rundown of how I do it. There's nothing else really to show you. It's just time and working away at it. Now don't forget, this is only 25mm high, so if your character's only going to be printed at 25mm, there's no point going crazy on detail and smoothness and making sure everything's perfect. It's just striking a balance between detail and a finish you're happy with. Well, that wraps up our adding detail to geometry video. I hope you found it useful, and there were some tips and tricks in there that you can use in your own workflow. If you liked the video, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe. Well, that's all for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.